10. And too soon marred are those so early made. The earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. Lucas followed Bernard through the halls of IT, nervous techs scattering before them like night bugs startled by the light. Bernard didn't seem to notice the techs ducking into offices and peering through windows. Lucas hurried to keep up, his eyes darting side to side, feeling conspicuous with all these hidden others watching. "Aren't I a little old to be shadowing for another job?" he asked. He was pretty sure he hadn't accepted the offer, not verbally anyway, but Bernard spoke as if the deal were done.
"Nonsense," he said, "and this won't be shadowing in the traditional sense."
He waved his hand in the air.
"You'll continue your duties as before. I just need someone who can step in, who knows what to do in case something happens to me. My will—"
He stopped at the heavy door to the server room and turned to face Lucas.
"If it came to it, in an emergency, my will would explain everything to the next head, but—"
He gazed over Lucas's shoulder and down the hall.
"Sims is my executor, which will have to change. I just don't see that ever going smoothly."
Bernard rubbed his chin and lost himself in his thoughts. Lucas waited a moment, then stepped beside him and entered his code on the panel by the door, fished his ID out of his pocket, made sure it was his ID and not Juliet's, and swiped it through the reader. The door clicked open, snapping Bernard out of his thoughts.
"Yes, well, this will be much better. Not that I expect to go anywhere, mind you."
He adjusted his glasses and stepped through the heavy steel doorway. Lucas followed, pushing the monstrous enclosure shut behind them and waiting for the locks to engage. "But if something did happen to you, I would oversee the cleanings?" Lucas couldn't imagine. He suspected there was more to learn about those suits than the servers. Sammy would be better at this, would actually want this job. Also, would he have to abandon his star charts?
"That's a small part of the job, but yes."
Bernard guided Lucas through the servers, past number 13 with its blank face and still fans, all the way to the back of the room.
"These are the keys to the true heart of the silo,"
Bernard said, fishing a jangling set out of his coveralls. They were strung on a cord of leather that hung around his neck. Lucas had never noticed them before.
"There are other features to this cabinet that you'll learn about in time. For now, you simply need to know how to get downstairs."
He inserted the key into several locks on the back of the server, locks designed to look like recessed screws. What server was this? 28? Lucas glanced around the room and tried to count its position, and realized he'd never been assigned to maintain this tower. There was a gentle clang as the back came off. Bernard set it aside, and Lucas saw why he'd never worked on the machine. It was practically empty. Just a shell, like it had been scrapped for parts over the long years.
"It's crucial that you lock this after coming back up."
Lucas watched Bernard grab a handle in the bottom of the empty chassis. He pulled up, and there was a soft grinding noise nearby.
"When the grate's back in place, you simply press this down to secure it."
He was about to ask, what grate, when Bernard stepped aside and dug his fingers into the metal slats of the floor. With a grunt, he pulled the heavy surface of the flooring up and began sliding it over. Lucas jumped around to the other side and bent down to help. "Wouldn't the stairs?" he started to ask.
"They don't access this part of 35.
Bernard waved at a ladder leading down through the floor.
"You go first."
Lucas's head spun from the day's sudden turn. As he bent to grab the ladder, he felt the contents of his breast pocket shift and shot a hand up to hold the watch, ring, and ID steady. What had he been thinking? What was he thinking now? He lowered himself down the long ladder, feeling like someone had initiated an automated routine in his brain, a rote program. He felt the contents of his breast pocket shift and shot a hand up to hold the watch, ring, and ID steady. What had he been thinking? What was he thinking now? He lowered himself down the long ladder, feeling like someone had initiated an automated routine in his brain, a rote program that had taken over his actions. From the bottom of the ladder, he watched as Bernard lowered himself down the first rungs before sliding the grate into place, sealing them both inside the dark dungeon beneath the already fortressed server room.
You are about to receive a great gift, Bernard said in the darkness, just as I was once granted the same.
He flicked on a light, and Lucas saw that his boss was grinning maniacally, the anger from before gone. Here was a new man before him, a confident and eager man.
All the silo and everyone in it hinges on what I'm about to show you, Bernard said.
He waved Lucas down the brightly lit but tight corridor and toward a wider room beyond. The servers felt very far above. They felt closed off from every other soul in the silo. Lucas was curious, but also afraid. He wasn't sure he wanted such responsibility and cursed himself for going along with this. And yet, his feet moved. They carried him down that hidden passageway and into a room full of the strange and curious, a place that made the charting of stars seem insignificant, a den where the sense of the world's scale, of size, took on wholly new proportions. "11. I'll bury thee in a triumphant grave. A grave? Oh no! A lantern, slaughtered youth. For here lies Juliet, and her beauty makes this vault a feasting presence full of light." Juliet left her soup-slathered helmet on the floor and moved toward the pale green glow of light. It seemed brighter than before. She wondered how much of the darkness had been her helmet. As her senses returned, she remembered that it wasn't a piece of glass she'd been looking through, but some infernal screen that took the world as she saw it and overlaid it with half a lie. Maybe it had dimmed her view in the process. She noticed the stench from her drenched suit followed her, the smell of rotten vegetables and mold, or possibly the toxic fumes from the outside world. Her throat burned a little as she crossed the cafeteria toward the stairwell. Her skin began to itch, and she couldn't tell if it was from fear, from her imagination, or truly something in the air. She didn't dare risk finding out, so she held her breath and hurried as fast as her weary legs would take her, around the corner to where she knew the stairs would be. "This world is the same as my world," she thought to herself, stumbling down the first flight of stairs in the wan glow of emergency light strips. The gods built more than one. Her heavy boots, still dripping with soup, felt unsteady on the metal treads. At the landing on 2, she paused and took in a few gulps of air, less painful gulps, and considered how best to remove the infernal and bulky outfit that made every moment awkward, that reeked of the fetid smell of rot and outside air. She looked down at her arms. The thing had required help to don. There were double zippers in the back, layers of Velcro, miles of heat tape. She looked at the knife in her hand, suddenly grateful that she had never dropped it after using it to remove her helmet. Gripping the knife with one clumsy glove, She carefully inserted the tip through the other sleeve, right above the top of her wrist. She forced the point through, pushing the blade over the top of her arm so it wouldn't jab her even if it pierced all the way. The fabric was difficult to cut, but a tear finally formed as she augured the handle in small circles. She slid the knife into this tiny rip, the dull side of the blade facing her skin, and slid it down her arm and toward her knuckles. When the tip of the blade ripped through the fabric between her fingers, she was able to free her hand from the long gash she'd made, the sleeve flopping from her elbow. Juliet sat down on the grating, moved the knife to her newly freed hand, and worked on the other side. She freed it as well while soup dripped from her shoulders and down her arms. She next started a tear at her chest, managing better control of the knife now without the thick gloves on. She ripped the metal foil exterior away, peeling herself like an orange. The solid collar for her helmet had to stay. It was attached to her charcoal fabric undersuit as well as the reinforced zippers up her back, but piece by piece she removed the shiny outer coat, which was slathered with a nastiness she attributed partly to the soup and partly to her trek over the hills. Next came her boots, which were cut free around the ankles until she was able to work them off, sawing a slit down the outside edge and popping one foot free, then the other. Before she cleaned up the hanging tatters of fabric any further, or worried about the material still attached to the zipper at her back, she got up from the landing and hurried down the steps, putting more distance between herself and the air above that seemed to scratch at her throat. She was another 2 flights down, swimming through the green glow of the stairwell, before she appreciated the fact that she was alive. She was alive. For however much longer, this was a brutal, beautiful, and brand new fact for Juliet. She had spent 3 days climbing long stairs similar to these as she came to grips with her fate. Another day and night had been spent in a cell made for the future corpses who dotted the landscape. And then, this. An impossible trek through the wilderness of the forbidden, breaking into the impenetrable and the unknown, surviving. Whatever happened next, for this moment, Juliet flew down foreign steps in bare feet, the steel cool against her tingling skin, the air burning her throat less and less with each gulp of new air, the raw stench and memory of death receding further and further above her. Soon, it was just the patter of her joyous descent ringing out and drifting down a lonely and empty darkness, like a muffled bell that rang not for the dead, but for the living. She stopped on 6 and rested while she worked on what remained of her protective suit. With care, she sliced her black undersuit by her shoulders and collarbone, working the tear all the way around and clawing at her back as it ripped free, strips of heat tape still attached. Once the helmet collar was detached from the fabric, just the zipper hanging like a second spine along her back, she could finally remove it from her neck. She pulled it off and dropped it to the ground, then stripped off the rest of the black carbon fabric, peeling away the arms and legs and leaving all the material in a rough pile outside the double doors to level 6. 6 should be an apartment level, she thought. She considered going inside and yelling out for help or looking for clothes and supplies in the many rooms, but her greater impulse was to descend. The up top felt poisoned and too close. It didn't matter if it was all in her imagination, or if it was from her miserable experiences living in the up top of her own silo. Her body felt a revulsion for the place. Safe was the down deep. It had always felt this way. One hopeful image did linger from the upper kitchen. The rows and rows of canned and jarred food for the lean harvests. Juliet figured there would be more in the lower mess halls as well, and the air in the silo seemed decent as she regained her breath. The sting in her lungs and on her tongue had faded. Either the vast silo held a lot of air that was now being consumed by no one, or there was still a source. All these thoughts gave her hope, these tallies of resources. So she left her spoiled and tattered clothing behind, and armed with only a large chef's knife, she stole down the curved stairs naked, her body becoming more and more alive with every step taken, her mind becoming more determined to keep the rest of her that way. On 13, she stopped and checked inside the doors. There was always the chance that this silo was laid out completely differently, floor to floor, so it made little sense to plan ahead if she didn't know what to expect. There were only a handful of areas in the uptop that she was intimately familiar with, and every bit of overlap so far had seemed a perfect copy. 13 she would definitely know. There were certain things, learned so young and remembered so deep, that they felt like little stones in the center of her mind. These would be the parts of her that rotted last, the bits left over once the rest skittered off on the wind or was drunk deep by the roots. In her mind, as she pushed the door open a crack, she wasn't in a different silo, an abandoned husk of a silo, but in her past, pushing open a door on her youth. It was dark inside, none of the security or emergency lights on. There was a different smell. The air was stagnant and had a tinge of decay. Juliet shouted down the hallway, "Hello?" She listened to her voice echo back from the empty walls. The voice that returned sounded distant, weaker, higher than her own. She imagined herself at age 9, running through these very halls, crying out to her older self across the years. She tried to picture her mother chasing behind that girl, attempting to scoop her up and force her to be still, but the ghosts evaporated in the darkness. The last of the echoes faded, leaving her alone and naked in the doorway. As her eyes adjusted, she could just barely make out a reception desk at the end of the hall. Light reflected off glass windows just where they should be. It was the exact same layout as her father's nursery in the Mids, the place where she had been not just born, but raised. It was hard to believe that this was someplace different, that other people had lived here, other children had been born, had played, and had been raised just over a hill and down a dip, had given chase or challenged each other to hop or whatever games they had invented, all of them unaware of the other. Maybe it was from standing in the doorway of a nursery, but she couldn't help but think of all the lives this place had contained. People growing up, falling in love, burying their dead. All those people outside. People she had desecrated with her boots, scattering their bones and ashes as she kicked her way into the very place they had fled. Juliet wondered how long ago it had happened, how long since the silo had been abandoned. What had happened here? The stairwell was still lit, which meant the battery room still held juice. She needed paper to do the math, to figure how recently or how long ago all this life had turned to death. There were practical reasons for wanting to know, beyond the mere itch of curiosity. With one last look inside, one final shudder of regret for not stopping to see her father the last few times she'd passed his nursery, Juliet shut the door on the darkness and the ghosts and considered her predicament. She could very well be perfectly alone in a dying silo. The thrill of being alive at all was quickly draining away, replaced with the reality of her solitude and the tenuousness of her survival. Her stomach grumbled its agreement. She could somehow still smell the fetid soup on her, could taste the stomach acid from her retching. She needed water. She needed clothes. These primal urges were pushed to the forefront, drowning out the severity of her situation, the daunting tasks before her, leaving the regrets of the past behind. If the layout was the same, The first hydroponic farm would be 4 floors down. The larger of the 2 upper dirt farms would lie just below that. Juliet shivered from an updraft of cold air. The stairwell was creating its own thermal cycle, and it would only be colder the further down she went. But she went anyway. Lower was better. At the next level, she tried the door. It was too dark to see past the first interior hallway, but it seemed like offices or workrooms. She tried to remember what would be on the 14th in her own silo, but didn't know. Was it incredible to not know? The up top of her own home had somehow been strange to her. That made this silo something completely alien. She held the door to 14 open and stuck the blade of her knife between the slits of metal that formed every landing's grating. The handle was left sticking up to form a stop. She allowed the door to close on its sprung hinges until it rested on the handle, holding it open. This let in enough light for her to steal inside and grope around the first handful of rooms. There were no coveralls hanging on the backs of the doors, but one room was set up for conferences. The water in the pitchers had long evaporated out, but the purple tablecloth looked warm enough. Warmer than being naked. Juliet moved the assortment of cups, plates, and pitchers and grabbed the cloth. She wrapped it around her shoulders, but it was going to slip off when she moved, so she tried knotting the corners in front of her. Giving up on this, she ran back to the landing, out into the welcomed light, and removed the fabric completely. Grabbing the knife, the door squealing eerily shut behind her, she pushed the blade through the center of the tablecloth and cut a long gash. Her head went through this, the cloth falling past her feet in front and behind her. A few minutes with the blade, and she'd cut away the excess, forming a belt out of a long strip, and, from another shock of fabric, enough to tie over her head and keep it warm. It felt good to be making something, to be engineering her way through one particular problem. She had a tool, a weapon, if need be, and clothes. The impossible list of tasks had been whittled down a few shavings. She descended further, her feet cold on the stairs, dreaming of boots, thirsty for water, very much aware of all that remained for her to do. On 15, she was reminded of another necessity as her weary legs nearly gave way. Her knees buckled. She grabbed the railing, and she realized, as the adrenaline evaporated from her veins, that she was deathly tired. She paused on the landing, hands on her knees, and took a few deep breaths. How long had she been going? How much further could she push herself? She checked her reflection in the blade of the knife, saw how horrible she looked, and decided she needed rest before she went any further. Rest now, while it was still warm enough to not shiver to pieces. It was tempting to explore that level for a bed, but she decided against it. There would be little comfort in the pitch black behind those doors. So she curled up on the steel grating of landing 15, tucked her arms under her head, and adjusted the tablecloth so every patch of bare skin was covered. And before she could go over the long list forming in her head, exhaustion took over. She drifted off to sleep with only a moment's panic that she shouldn't be so tired, that this might be the sort of nap one never woke up from, that she was destined to join the residents of this strange place, curled up and unmoving, frozen and lifeless, rotting and wasting away. But old folks, many fain as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. Do you understand what you're proposing we do? Knox looked up at McLean, met her wrinkled and wizened eyes with as much confidence as he could muster. The tiny woman who controlled all the silo's spares and fabrication cast an oddly imposing figure. She didn't have Knox's barrel chest or thick beard, had wrists barely bigger than 2 of his fingers, But she possessed a wizened gray gaze and the weight of hard years that made him feel but a shadow in her presence.
"It's not an uprising," he said,
the forbidden words moving easily with the grease of habit and time.
"We're setting things to right."
McLean sniffed.
"I'm sure that's what my great-grandparents said."
She pushed back loose strands of silver hair and peered down at the blueprint spread out between them. It was as if she knew this was wrong, but had resigned herself to helping rather than hinder it. Maybe it was her age, Knox thought, peering at her pink scalp through hair so thin and white as to be like filaments of glass. Perhaps with enough time in these walls, one could become resigned to things never getting better, or even changing all that much. Or maybe a person eventually lost hope that there was anything worth preserving at all. He looked down at the blueprint and smoothed the sharp creases in the fine paper. He was suddenly aware of his hands, how thick and grease-limbed his fingers appeared. He wondered if McLean saw him as a brute, storming up here with delusions of justice. She was old enough to see him as young, he realized, young and hot-tempered, while he thought of himself as being old and wise. One of the dozens of dogs that lived among Supply's stacks grunted discontentedly under the table as if all this war planning were spoiling its nap.
"I think it's safe to assume IT knows something is coming,"
McLean said, running her small hands across the many floors between them and 34.
"Why? You don't think we were discreet coming up?"
She smiled up at him.
"I'm sure you were, but it's safe to assume this because it would be dangerous to assume otherwise."
He nodded and chewed on the part of his beard below his lower lip.
"How long will the rest of your mechanics take to get here?"
McLean asked.
"They'll leave around 10 when the stairwell is dimmed and be here by 2, 3 at the latest. They'll be loaded down." "And you think a dozen of your men is sufficient to keep things running down below?" "As long as nothing major breaks, yeah."
He scratched the back of his neck.
"Where do you think the porters will fall? Or the people from the mids?"
She shrugged.
"The mids see themselves as toppers, mostly. I know, I spent my childhood up there. They go for the view and eat at the cafe as much as they can, justifying the climb. The toppers are another question. I think we have more hope among them."
Knox wasn't sure he heard her correctly.
"Say again?"
She looked up at him, and Knox felt the dog nuzzling against his boots, looking for company or warmth.
"Well, think about it," McLean said. "Why are you so riled up? Because you lost a good friend? That happens all the time. No, it's because you were lied to. And the toppers will feel this ever more keenly, trust me. They live in sight of those who've been lied to. It's the mids, the people who aspire upward without knowing and who look down on us without compassion, that will be the most reluctant." "So you think we have allies up top?" "That we can't get to, yeah. And they would take some convincing. A fine speech like you poisoned my people with."
She gifted him with a rare grin, and Knox felt himself beaming in return. And right then he knew, instantly, why her people were devoted to her. It was similar to the pull he had on others, but for different reasons. People feared him and wanted to feel safe, but they respected McLean and wanted to feel loved.
"The problem we're going to have is that the mids are what separates us from IT."
She drew her hand across the blueprint.
"So we need to get through there quick, but without starting a fight." "I thought we'd just storm up before dawn,"
Knox grumbled. He leaned back and peered under the table at the dog, who was half sitting on one of his boots and looking up at him with its foolish tongue hanging out, tail wagging. All Knox saw in the animal was a machine that ate food and left shit behind. A furry ball of meat he wasn't allowed to eat. He nudged the filthy thing off his boot.
"Scram,"
he said.
"Jackson, get over here."
McLean snapped her fingers.
"I don't know why you keep those things around, much less breed more of them." "You wouldn't," McLean snapped back. "They're good for the soul. for those of us who have 'em."
He checked to see if she was serious and found her smiling a little more easily now.
"Well, after we set this place right, I'm gonna push for a lottery for them, too. Get their numbers under control."
He returned her sarcastic smile. Jackson whined until McLean reached down to pet him.
"If we were all as loyal as this to each other, there'd never need to be an uprising," she said, peering up at him.
He dipped his head, unable to agree. There had been a few dogs in mechanical over the years, enough for him to know that some people felt this way, even if he didn't. He always shook his head at those who spent hard-earned chits on food that would fatten a thing that would never fatten him in return. When Jackson crossed under the table and rubbed against his knee, whining to be petted, he left his hands spread out on the blueprint, defiant.
"What we need for the trip up is a diversion," McLean said. "Something to thin the numbers in the mids. It'd be nice if we could get more of them to go up top, because we're going to make a racket moving this many people up the stairs."
"We? Wait, you don't think you're coming?"
"If my people are, then of course I am." She inclined her head. "I've been climbing ladders in the stockroom for over 50 years. You think a few flights of stairs will give me grief?"
Knox wasn't sure anything could give her grief. Jackson's tail thumped the leg of the table as the mutt stood there, looking up at him with that dumb grin his breed habitually wore.
"What about welding doors shut on the way up?" Knox asked. "Keep 'em in until all this is over."
"And do what afterwards? Just apologize? What if this takes weeks?"
"Weeks?"
"You don't think it'll be that easy, do you? Just march up and take the reins?"
"I'm under no delusions about what comes next."
He pointed at her office door, which led out to the workshops full of clacking machinery.
"Our people are building the implements of war, and I aim to use them if it comes to that. I will gladly take a peaceful transfer, would be satisfied pushing Bernard and a few others out to clean, but I have never shied from getting dirty, either."
McLean nodded.
"Just so we're both clear."
"Clear as glass," he said.
He clapped his hands, an idea forming. Jackson ducked away from the sudden noise.
"I've got it," he told her. "A diversion."
He pointed to the lower floors of mechanical on the blueprint.
"What if we have Jenkins cascade a power outage? We could start a few levels above this, or even better, with the farms and the mess halls. Blame it on the recent generator work."
"And you think the mids will clear out?"
She narrowed her eyes.
"If they want a warm meal, or they'll hunker down in the dark."
"I think they'll be in the stairwell gossiping, wondering what all the fuss is about, even more in our way."
"Then we'll tell them we're going up to fix the problem."
Knox felt himself getting frustrated. The damn dog was sitting on his boot again.
"Up to fix a problem?" McLean laughed. "When's the last time that made any sense?"
Knox pulled on his beard. He wasn't sure what was so complicated. There were a lot of them. They worked with tools all day. They were going to go beat in tech heads, little men like Bernard who sat on their butts and clacked on keyboards like secretaries. They just needed to go up there and do it.
"You got any better ideas?" he asked.
"We need to keep in mind the after," McLean said. "After you've bludgeoned some people to death and the blood is dripping through the grates, what then? Do you want people living in fear of that happening again, or of whatever you put them through to get there?"
"I only want to hurt those that lied," he said. "That's all any of us want. We've all lived in fear. Fear of the outside, fear of cleaning, afraid to even talk about a better world, and none of it was true. The system was rigged, and in a way to make us hang our heads and take it."
Jackson barked up at him and began to whine, his tail swishing the floor like a dropped air hose with a stuck nozzle that had gone out of control.
"I think when we're done," he said, "and we start talking about using our know-how to explore a world we've only ever looked out at, I think that's going to inspire some people. Hell, it gives me hope. Don't you feel anything?"
He reached down and rubbed Jackson's head, which stopped the animal from making so much noise. McLean looked at him for a while. She finally bobbed her head in agreement.
"We'll go with the power outage," she said with finality. Tonight, before any who went to see the cleaning return disappointed. I'll lead up a squad with candles and flashlights, make it look like a goodwill mission headed by supply. You'll follow a few hours later with the rest. We'll see how far the repair story gets us before we run into trouble. Hopefully, a good number will be staying in the up top, or back in their beds in the mids, too exhausted from climbing for a meal to care about the commotion.
There'll be less traffic those early hours, Knox agreed, so maybe we won't run into too much trouble.
The goal will be to hit IT and contain it. Bernard is still playing mayor, so he probably won't be there, but he'll either come to us or we'll push up after him once the 30s are secure. I don't think he'll put up much of a fight, not once his floors are ours.
Agreed,
Knox said, and it felt good to have a plan, to have an ally.
And hey, thanks for this.
McLean smiled.
You give a good speech for a greaser, she said. And besides, she nodded toward the dog, Jackson likes you, and he's hardly ever wrong. Not about men.
Knox looked down and realized he was still scratching the mutt. He pulled his hand away and watched the animal pant, staring up at him. In the next room, someone laughed at a joke, the voices of his mechanics mixing with the members of supply, all gently muffled by the wall and door. This laughter was joined by the sounds of steel rods bending into shape, flat pieces hammered sharp, machines for making rivets turned instead into making bullets. And Knox knew what McLean meant about loyalty. He saw it in that dumb dog's eyes, that it would do anything for him if only he would ask. And this weight bearing down on his chest, of the many who felt that way for him and for McLean, Knox decided that this was the heaviest burden of them all. "13. Death's pale flag is not advanced there." The dirt farm below filled the stairwell with a rich smell of fresh rot. Juliet was still waking up as she descended another level and began noticing the scent. She had no idea how long she'd slept. It had felt like days, but could have been hours. She had woken with her face pressed to the grating, a pattern of red lines marking her cheek, and had gotten underway immediately. Her stomach was gnawing at her, the odor from the farm hurrying her along. By 28, the pungency hung in the air so thick it felt like she was swimming through the scents. It was the smell of death, she decided, of funerals, of loamy soil turned over, releasing all those tangy molecules into the air. She stopped on 30, the hydroponic farms, and tried the doors. It was dark inside. There was a sound down the hallway, the whir of a fan or a motor. It was a strange encounter, this small noise. For over a day she had heard nothing but the sounds she made herself. The green glow of the emergency lights were no company. They were like the heat of a dying body, of batteries draining with a leak of photons. But this was something moving, some sound beyond her own breathing and footfalls, and it lurked deep in the dark corridors of the hydroponic farms. Once again, she left her only tool and defense behind as a doorstop to allow in a trickle of light. She stole inside, the smell of vegetation not as strong as in the stairwell, and padded down the hallway with one hand on the wall. The offices and reception area were dark and lifeless, the air dry. There was no blinking light on the turnstile, and she had no card or chit to feed it. She placed her hands on the supports and vaulted over, this small act of defiance somehow powerful, as though she had come to accept the lawlessness of this dead place, the complete lack of civilization, of rules. The light spilling from the stairwell barely reached the first of the growing rooms. She waited while her eyes adjusted, thankful for this ability honed by the down deeps of mechanical and the dark interiors of broken machines. What she saw, barely, when she was finally able, did not inspire her. The hydroponic gardens had rotted away. Thick stalks, like ropes, hung here and there from a network of suspended pipes. It gave her an idea of how long ago these farms had succumbed, if not the silo. It hadn't been hundreds of years, and it hadn't been days. Even a window that wide felt like a treasure of information, the first crumb toward an answer to this mysterious place. She rapped one of the pipes with her knuckles and heard the solid thud of fullness. No plants, but water. Her mouth seemed to dry out with just the prospect. Juliet leaned over the railing and into the growing room. She pressed her mouth to one of the holes in the top of a pipe where the stalk of a plant should be growing. She created a tight seal and sucked. The fluid that met her tongue was brackish and foul, but wet. And the taste was not of anything chemical or toxic, but stale organics. Dirt. It was only slightly more distasteful than the grease and oil she had practically been drenched in for 2 decades. So she drank until she was full. And she realized, now that she had water, that if there were more crumbs to find, more clues, she might just live long enough to gather them. Before she left, Juliet snapped a section of pipe off at the end of a run, keeping the cap intact on one side. It was only a little over an inch in diameter and no more than 2 feet long, but it would work as a thermos. She gently bent the broken pipe that remained down, allowing water to flow from the remaining loop. While she topped up her pipe, she splashed some water on her hands and arms, still fearful of contamination from the outside. Once her pipe was full, Juliet stole back toward the lit doorway at the end of the hall. There were 3 hydroponic farms, all with closed loops that wound through long and twisting corridors. She tried to do a rough calculation in her head, but all she could come up with was enough to drink for a very long time. The aftertaste was awful, and she wouldn't be surprised if her stomach cramped from the contents, but if she could get a fire going, find enough fabric or leftover paper to burn, even that could be helped with a good boil. Back in the stairwell, she returned to the rich odor she had left behind. She retrieved her knife and hurried down another thick slice of the silo, almost 2 times around the stairwell to the next landing, and checked the door. The smell was definitely coming from the dirt farms, and Juliet could hear that whirring again, louder now. She stopped the door and propped her thermos against the railing and checked inside. The smell of vegetation was overpowering. Ahead, in the dim green glow, she could see bushy arms reaching over the railings and into the pathway. She vaulted the security gate and explored the edge, one hand on the wall while her eyes adjusted again. There was definitely a pump running somewhere. She could also hear water dripping, either from a leak or a functioning tap. Juliet felt chills from the leaves brushing her arms. The smell of rot was distinguishable now. It was the odor of fruit and vegetables decaying in the soil and withering on the vine. She heard the buzz of flies, the sounds of life. She reached into a thick stand of green and felt around until her hand hit something smooth. Juliet gave it a tug and held a plump tomato up to the light. Her timeline estimate suddenly shrank. How long could the dirt farms sustain themselves? Did tomatoes require seeding, or did they come back every year like the weeds? She couldn't remember. She took a bite, the tomato not yet fully ripe, and heard a noise behind her. Another pump clicking on? She turned just in time to see the door to the stairwell slamming closed, plunging the dirt farm into absolute darkness. Juliet froze. She waited for the sound of her knife rattling down through the staircase. She tried to imagine that it could have slipped and fallen on its own. With the light extinguished, her ears seemed to hijack the unused portion of her brain. Her breathing, even her pulse, seemed audible, the whirring of the pump louder now. Tomato in hand, she crouched down and moved toward the other wall, arms stretched out to feel her way. She slid toward the exit, staying low to avoid the plants, trying to calm herself. There were no ghosts here, nothing to be spooked about. She repeated this to herself as she slowly crept forward. And then an arm was on her, reaching over her shoulder. Juliet cried out and dropped the tomato. The arm grabbed her shoulder, pinning her down in a crouch as she tried to stand. She slapped at this intruder, tried to pull away from it, the tablecloth bonnet yanked from her head, until finally she felt the hard steel of the turnstile, one of the waist bars jutting out in the hallway, and felt the fool. "You about gave me a heart attack," she told the machine. She reached for its sides and lifted herself over. She would come back for more food once she had light. Leaving the turnstile and heading for the exit, one hand on the wall and another groping ahead of herself, Juliet wondered if she would start talking to objects now, start going crazy. As the darkness absorbed her, she realized her mindset was changing by the minute. Resigned to her death the day before, now she was frightened of mere insanity. It was an improvement. Her hand finally bumped into the door, and Juliet pushed it open. She cursed the loss of the knife. It was certainly missing from the grating. She wondered how far it might have fallen, if she'd ever find it again, or maybe a replacement. She turned to grab her thermos, and saw that it was missing as well. Juliet felt her vision narrow, her heart quicken. She wondered if the closing of the door could have toppled her thermos. She wondered how the knife had slipped through a gap in the grating narrower than its handle, and as the pounding in her temples receded, she heard something else. Footsteps, ringing out on the stairwell below her. Running! "14. These violent delights have violent ends." The countertop in supply rattled with the implements of war. Guns, freshly milled and wholly forbidden, were lined up like so many sticks of steel. Knox picked one up, could feel the heat in a barrel recently bored and rifled, and hinged the stock to expose the firing chamber. He reached into one of the buckets of shiny bullets, the casings chopped from thin tubes of pipe and packed with blasting powder, and slotted one into the brand-new gun. The operation of the machine seemed simple enough. Point and pull the lever. "Careful where you aim that," one of the men of supply said, leaning out of the way. Knox raised the barrel toward the ceiling and tried to picture in his mind what one of these could do. He'd only ever seen a gun once, a smaller one on the hip of that old deputy, a gun he'd always figured was more for show. He stuffed a fistful of deadly rounds in his pocket, thinking how each one could end an individual life, and understanding why such things were forbidden. Killing a man should be harder than waving a length of pipe in their direction. It should take long enough for one's conscience to get in the way. One of the supply workers emerged from the stacks with a tub in his hands. The bend of his back and sag of his shoulders told Knox the thing was heavy.
"Just 24 of these so far,"
the man said, hoisting the bin to the counter. Knox reached inside and pulled out one of the heavy cylinders. His mechanics and even some of the men and women in yellow eyed the bin nervously.
"Slam that end on something hard,"
the man behind the counter said, just as calmly as if he were doling out an electrical relay to a customer and giving some last-minute installation advice.
"Like a wall, the floor, the butt of your gun, anything like that, and then get rid of it."
"Are they safe to carry?" Shirley asked as Knox stuffed one into his hip pocket.
"Oh yeah, it takes some force."
Several people reached their arms in and clattered around for one. Knox caught McLean's eyes as she took one for herself and slotted it into a pocket on her chest. The look on her face was one of cool defiance. She must see how disappointed he was in her coming, and he could tell at a glance that there would be no reasoning with her.
"All right," she said,
turning her gray-blue eyes toward the men and women gathered around the counter.
Listen up. We've got to get back open for business, so if you're carrying a gun, grab some ammo. There are strips of canvas over there. Wrap these things up as best you can to keep them out of sight. My group is leaving in 5 minutes, got that? Those of you in the second wave can wait in the back, out of sight.
Knox nodded. He glanced over at Mark and Shirley, both of whom would join him in the second wave. The slower climbers would go first and act casual. The stouter legs would follow and make a strong push, hopefully converging on 34 at the same time. Each group would be conspicuous enough, combined, and they might as well sing their intentions while they marched. "You okay, boss?" Shirley rested her rifle on her shoulder and frowned at him. He rubbed his beard and wondered how much of his stress and fear was shining through.
"Fine," he grumbled. Yeah.
Mark grabbed a bomb, stashed it away, and rested a hand on his wife's shoulder. Knox felt a pang of doubt. He wished the women didn't have to get involved, at least the wives. He continued to hope that none of this violence would be necessary, but it was getting harder and harder to pretend as eager hands took up arms. They were, all of them, now capable of taking lives, and he reckoned they were angry enough to do so. McLean stepped through the opening in the counter and sized him up.
"Well, this is it then."
She reached out a hand. Knox accepted it. He admired the strength in the woman.
"We'll see you on 35 and go up the last level together," he said. "Don't have all the fun without us."
She smiled.
"Oh, we won't."
"And good climbing."
He looked to the men and women gathering up behind her.
"All of you. Good luck and see you soon."
There were stern nods and clenched jaws. The small army in yellow began to file for the door, but Knox held McLean back.
"Hey," he said, "no trouble till we catch up, okay?"
She slapped his shoulder and smiled.
"And when this goes down," Knox said, "I expect you at the very back, behind the—"
McLean stepped closer, a hand gripping Knox's sleeve. Her wrinkled face had suddenly hardened.
"And tell me, where will you be, Knox of Mechanical, when the bombs fly? When these men and women who look up to us are facing their gravest test, where will you be?"
Knox was taken back by the sudden attack, this quiet hiss that landed with all the force of a shout.
"You know we're all—"
He started to answer.
"Damn straight,"
McLean said, releasing his arm.
"And you'd better well know that I'll see you there."
"15. I dreamt my lady came and found me dead." Juliet stood perfectly still and listened to the sound of footsteps retreating down the stairwell. She could feel the vibrations in the railing. Goosebumps rushed up her legs and down her arms. She wanted to call out, to yell for the person to stop, but the sudden rush of adrenaline made her chest feel cold and empty. It was like a chill wind had forced itself deep into her lungs, crowding out her voice. People were alive and in the silo with her, and they were running away. She pushed away from the railing and dashed across the landing, hit the curved steps at a dead run, and took them as fast as her legs could take her. A flight down, as the adrenaline subsided, she found the lungs to yell, "Stop!" But the racket of her bare feet on the metal stairs likely drowned out her voice. She could no longer hear the person running, dared not to stop and listen for fear that they would get too far ahead. But as she passed the doorway on 31, she felt the panic that they might slip inside some level and get away. And if there were only a handful of them, hiding in the vast silo, she may never find them. Not if they didn't want to be found. Somehow, this was more terrifying than anything else, that she might live the rest of her days foraging and surviving in a dilapidated silo, talking to inanimate objects, while a group of people did the same and stayed out of sight. It so stressed her that it took a while to consider the opposite. that this might instead be a group who would seek her out and not have the best intentions. They wouldn't have the best intentions, but they would have her knife. She stopped at 32 to listen. Holding her breath to keep quiet was almost impossible. Her lungs were crying out for deep gulps of air. But she remained still, the pulse in her palms beating against the cool railing, the distinct sound of footsteps still below her and louder now. She was catching up. She took off again, emboldened, taking the steps 3 at a time, her body sideways as she danced down the stairs as she had in youth, one hand on the curving railing, the other held out in front of her for balance, the balls of her feet just barely touching a tread before she was flying down to the next, concentrating lest she slip. A spill could be deadly at such speeds. Images of casts on arms and legs and stories of the unfortunate elderly with broken hips came to mind. Still, she pushed her limits, positively flying. 33 went by in a blaze. Half a spiral later, over her footfalls, she heard a door slam. She stopped and looked up. She leaned over the railing and peered down. The footfalls were gone, leaving just the sound of her panting for air. Juliet hurried down another rotation of the steps and checked the door on 34. It wouldn't open. It wasn't locked, though. The handle clicked down and the door moved, but caught on something. Juliet tugged as hard as she could, but to no avail. She yanked again and heard something crack. With a foot braced on the other door, she tried a 3rd time, yanking sharply, snapping her head back, pulling her arms toward her chest and kicking with her foot. Something snapped. The door flew open and she lost her grip on the handle. There was an explosion of light from inside, a bright burst of illumination spilling out the door before it slammed shut again. Juliet scrambled across the landing and grabbed the handle. She pulled the door open and struggled to her feet. One broken half of a broomstick lay inside the hallway. The other half hung from the handle of the neighboring door. Both stood out in the blinding light all around her. The overhead lamps inside the room were fully lit, the bright rectangles in the ceiling marching down the hall and out of sight. Juliet listened for footsteps, but heard little more than the buzzing of the bulbs. The turnstile ahead of her winked its red eye over and over, like it knew secrets but wouldn't tell. She got up and approached the machine, looked to the right where a glass wall peeked into a conference room, the lights full on in there as well. She hopped over the stile, the motion a habit already, and called out another hello. Her voice echoed back, but it sounded different in the lit air, if that were possible. There was life in here, electricity, other ears to hear her voice, which made the echoes somehow fainter. She passed offices, peeking in each one to look for signs of life. The place was a mess. Drawers dumped on the floor, metal filing cabinets tipped over, precious paper everywhere. One of the desks faced her, and Juliet could see that the computer was on, the screen full of green text. It felt as though she'd entered a dream world. In 2 days, assuming she'd slept that long, her brain had gradually acclimated to the pale green glow of the emergency lights, had grown used to a life in the wilderness, a life without power. She still had the taste of brackish water on her tongue, and now she strolled through a disheveled but otherwise normal workplace. She imagined the next shift. Did offices like these have shifts? Returning, laughing from the stairwell, shuffling papers and righting furniture and getting back to work. The thought of work had her wondering what they did here. She had never seen such a layout. She almost forgot about her flight down the stairs as she poked about, as curious about the rooms and power as the footsteps that had brought her here. Around a bend, she came to a wide metal door that, unlike the others, wouldn't open. Juliet heaved on it and felt it barely budge. She pressed her shoulder against the metal door and pushed it, a few inches at a time, until she could squeeze through. She had to step over a tall metal filing cabinet that had been yanked down in front of the heavy door in an attempt to hold it closed. The room was massive, at least as big as the generator room and far larger than the cafeteria. It was full of tall pieces of furniture, bigger than filing cabinets, but with no drawers. Instead, their fronts were covered with blinking lights, red, green, and amber. Juliet shuffled through paper that had spilled from the filing cabinet, and she realized, as she did so, that she couldn't be alone in the room. Someone had pulled the cabinet across the door, and they had to have done this from inside. "Hello?" She passed through the rows of tall machines, for that's what she figured they were. They hummed with electricity and now and then seemed to whir or clack like their innards were busy. She wondered if this were some sort of exotic power plant, providing the lighting perhaps. Or did these have stacks of batteries inside? Seeing all the cords and cables at the backs of the units had her leaning toward batteries. No wonder the lights were blaring. This was like 20 of Mechanical's battery rooms combined. "Is anyone here?" she called out. "I mean you no harm." She worked her way through the room, listening for any movement, until she came across one of the machines with its door hinged open. Peering inside, she saw not batteries, but boards like the kind Walker was forever soldering on. In fact, the guts of this machine looked eerily similar to the inside of the dispatch room's computer. Juliet stepped back, realizing what these were. "The servers," she whispered. She was in this silo's IT. Level 34, of course. There was a scraping sound near the far wall, the sound of metal sliding on metal. Juliet ran in that direction, darting between the tall units, wondering who the hell this was running from her and where they planned to hide. She rounded the last row of servers to see a portion of the floor moving, a section of metal grate sliding to cover a hole. Juliet dove for the floor, her tablecloth garb wrapping up her legs, her hands seizing the edge of the cover before it could close. Right in front of her, she saw the knuckles and fingers of a man's hands gripping the edge of the grate. There was a startled scream, a grunt of effort. Juliet tried to yank back on the grate but had no leverage. One of the hands disappeared. A knife took its place, snicking against the grate, hunting for her fingers. Juliet swung her feet beneath her and sat up for leverage. She yanked on the grate and felt the knife bite into her finger as she did so. She screamed. The man below her screamed. He emerged and held the knife between them, his hand shaking, the blade catching and reflecting the overhead lights. Juliet tossed the metal hatch away and clutched her hand, which was dripping blood. "Easy," she said, scooting out of reach. The man ducked his head down, then poked it back up. He looked past Juliet as if others were coming up behind her. She fought the urge to check, but decided to trust the silence just in case he was trying to fool her. "Who are you?" she asked. She wrapped part of her garment around her hand to bandage it. She noticed the man, his beard thick and unkempt, was wearing gray coveralls. They could have been made in her silo, with just slight differences. He stared at her, his dark hair wild and hanging shaggy over his face. He grunted, coughed into his hand, seemed prepared to duck down under the floor and disappear. "Stay," Juliet said. "I mean you no harm." The man looked at her wounded hand and at the knife. Juliet glanced down to see a thin trace of blood snaking toward her elbow. The wound ached, but she'd had worse in her time as a mechanic. Sorry, the man muttered. He licked his mouth and swallowed. The knife was trembling uncontrollably. "My name's Jules," she said, realizing this man was much more frightened of her than the other way around. "What's yours?" He glanced at the knife blade held sideways between them, almost as if checking a mirror. He shook his head. "No name," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "No need." "Are you alone?" she asked. He shrugged.
Solo,
he said.
Years.
He looked up at her.
Where did...
He licked his lips again, cleared his throat. His eyes watered and glinted in the light.
You come from? Well, what level?
You've been by yourself for years? Juliet said in wonder. She couldn't imagine. I didn't come from any level, she told him. I came from another silo. She enunciated this last softly and slowly, worried what this news might do to such a seemingly fragile man. But Solo nodded as if this made sense. It was not the reaction Juliet had expected.
The outside?
Solo looked again at the knife. He reached out of the hole and set it on the grating, slid it away from both of them.
Is it safe?
Juliet shook her head. No, she said. I had a suit. It wasn't a far walk, but still, I shouldn't be alive. Solo bobbed his head. He looked up at her, wet tracks running from the corners of his eyes and disappearing into his beard.
None of us should,
he said.
Not a one.